Tua te rangi e tu nei, tua te papa e takoto nei, tua te mira tangata. Te whare e tu nei, te marae e hora nei, te nakura, e te ho kainga, te nakoto, te nakoto, te nakoto katoa. I want to acknowledge the Pro-Chancellor and Vice-Chancellor, ko matua tuki, kai haranga Shirley, and all members of the official party. I want to also acknowledge those who, behind the scenes, have made this possible. Amanda and Nikki, and there will be many others. I'm very pleased to be able to acknowledge many old friends and many old colleagues. Too numerous to mention all of you, but I can see some of you. Thank you so very, very much for joining Jo, my wife, Professor Joan Taylor, for joining Jo and me today. Can I especially acknowledge Professor Margaret Wilson, founding Dean of the law school, who took a punt on me, as it were, in 1991 when she appointed me. And Professor Wilson has provided me with indispensable support and opportunities at critical points in my early career. Thank you very much, Margaret. I'm really indebted to you. As well as acknowledging old friends, I'd like to acknowledge some new friends. Thank you very much for joining me, new friends from Kaitiakitanga. Good afternoon, everybody. Talo falapa, namaste, salam alaikum, shalom. It feels good to be back, and I'm now going to take my hat off. But I'll be more comfortable. It feels good to be back. It's especially good to be back for this wonderful honour. I'm extremely grateful to everyone for those who have decided to grant me this privilege, and it really does mean a lot to me. So thank you very much indeed. And the university, as the Vice-Chancellor intimated, the university played a really important role in my life and the life of my whānau. As some of you will know, Jo taught in religious studies here on campus, and our son Robbie was born here in Kaitiakitanga. He and our daughter Emily schooled in Hillcrest, and coming back here, memories flood in. I remember walking through campus with Emily, who was then a little girl, and she urged me to skip with her, hand in hand, from one side of campus to the other. And we did, and it was quite a sight. On another occasion, Robbie, a little boy at that stage, was at home, and he was playing with a friend, and I returned to the house. I returned with a suitcase. I'd been travelling overseas, and he warmly greeted me, and his playmate that he was with said, "What does your dad do?" And Rob replied, "He travels around the world doing good." And then there was a long sigh, and he said, "But it never works." You see, I kept having to go back, right? So obviously, I failed to fix it the first time. Well, I can't be sure it'll work this afternoon either, but what I'd like to do is to make a few remarks. Human rights in Aotearoa have made a major contribution to our society, but in my humble opinion, they need urgently refreshing for our time and place. In Aotearoa, human rights are mainly associated with combating discrimination, and this struggle is of huge importance, and in the Human Rights Commission, most of our work is devoted to fighting discrimination. But human rights are not only about discrimination. They also include a range of other human rights, including, for instance, the right to a decent home. Successive New Zealand governments have legally agreed to implement these other human rights, but they have failed to adequately do so. Worse than that, some of these human rights are almost unknown and invisible in Aotearoa. Agreeing things in New York and burying them in Wellington is disgraceful, and it undermines trust and confidence in government. Human rights in Aotearoa have other elemental problems too. They need refreshing because human rights talk has become excessively legalistic and often divorced from everyday lives. Also, most people think that human rights only place responsibilities on government, whereas human rights place responsibilities on governments, on business, and indeed on individuals. Further, in relation to human rights, we have yet to strike a healthy balance between I and we, that is, between individual and community. Last year, two pillars of the British establishment, Sir Paul Collier and Sir John Kay, published a slim volume called Greed is Dead: Politics After Individualism. The authors are leading economists, and after reading the book, I was left wondering what they've been doing for the last 40 years. But nonetheless, the book makes important points, and it talks about what has been called, and I quote, destructive individualism. Community is vital to human beings, because community brings us a sense of belonging. The Norwegian Prime Minister, Erna Solberg, who has been forced to confront violent white supremacists, recently observed, "You don't attack what you feel that you belong to." So, how can we refresh human rights for our time and for our place here in Aotearoa? I think that we have to begin by reflecting on values and human rights. Prime Minister Ardern often talks about values. When she addressed the United Nations in the shadow of the 15th of March 2019, she affirmed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and she said this. She said, "What if we no longer see ourselves based on what we look like, what religion we practice, or where we live, but by what we value? Humanity," she said, "kindness, an innate sense of our connection to each other, and a belief that we are guardians not just of our home and our planet, but of each other." Last week, at the government's extremely turbulent hui on countering terrorism and violent extremism, she emphasized, "We are seeking guidance and ideas on strengthening our counter-terrorism strategy in a uniquely New Zealand way," and then she said, "recognizing our treaty relationship, our diversity, and our values." And the Prime Minister is absolutely right to emphasize the critical importance of values. Values are the glue that holds a society together. Values inform human rights, and crucially, human rights embody values. Human rights are designed to ensure that our values are not inadvertently overlooked or deliberately sacrificed on the altar of political expediency. Human rights help to ensure that, confronted by a national crisis, by a global pandemic or other emergency, our values are not unfairly compromised. human rights are a check on what Alex de Tocqueville called the tyranny of the majority. And human rights, it seems to me, are not only a check on the tyranny of the majority, they're also a check on the tyranny of the powerful. At root, human rights provide a check on the abuse of public power. Their primary purpose, the primary purpose of human rights, is to protect our values. But which values? If values inform human rights, and human rights embody values, which are among the values esteemed in Aotearoa? Te ao Māori is underpinned by whakapapa and by whanautaatanga, kinship. In this worldview, relationships between people, past, present and future, are of central importance. Also, the relationship between people and the natural world is crucial. Kaitiakitanga Stewardship, a system of reciprocal rights and responsibilities, arises from these relationships. It includes intergenerational responsibilities, and it also has spiritual dimensions. Mana requires the maintenance of these relationships and responsibilities. Te ao Māori reflects an indivisible relationship between Māori and whenua, which is reinforced by Te Tiriti o Waitangi. It includes an abiding sense of love for Papata Nuku, to which tangata whenua belong. In Aotearoa, our values encompass Te ao Māori and the worldviews of other communities. These values not only include those that I've already mentioned, they also include manaakitanga, dignity, fairness, decency, equality, freedom, well-being, safety, autonomy, participation, partnership, community, and responsibility. These are the values that provide the bedrock of society in Aotearoa. And these are the values that are embodied in human rights. And if human rights become estranged from these values, human rights lose their legitimacy, their authority, their currency, and their relevance. Values, however, values like culture are not set in stone. Values evolve as generations come and go. Because values evolve, so must human rights, but without compromising the essence of human rights. What is this essence of human rights? And here I cannot do the question justice, but I provide two laughably superficial responses. First, the essence of human rights coalesces around kaitiakitanga, manaakitanga, dignity, well-being, and the fair treatment of individuals and communities. The second response is this: the essence of human rights is encapsulated in what's known as the Golden Rule. The Golden Rule, which arguably is found in all major world religions and informs all major cultural ethical systems. The Golden Rule has a negative and a positive form. The positive form is this: do to others what you would have them do to you. It seems to me the Golden Rule might have an important role to play as we journey towards a multicultural society based on Te Tiriti o Waitangi. But my main point is this: human rights are inalienable, that is, they belong to everyone by virtue of their humanity, and they cannot be expunged. But human rights are not unchanging. Human rights have to be dynamic. As UN Secretary General Boutros Ghali put it in his opening address to the World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna in 1993, he said, "Human rights are in constant movement." If human rights become static, if they become relics from the past, they hinder progress. In Aotearoa, the dynamism of human rights enables them to play a constructive role, as we confront our colonial past and build a multicultural society based on Te Tiriti o Waitangi, in which everyone can meaningfully participate with dignity and respect. Last year, conscious of the values New Zealanders esteemed, I tried to reframe human rights as the 3 R's: relationships, responsibilities, and rights. First of all, briefly, relationships. At the heart of human rights, and at the heart of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, are respectful relationships between individuals and communities. I often hear inspiring stories about our rich multiculturalism grounded in Te Tiriti, but I also hear about communities talking past each other. And we really do need to give more attention to thoughtful relationship building between communities. That's the first R, relationships. The second, responsibilities. Although the provision is often overlooked, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights confirms that individuals have, and I quote, duties to the community. Of course, responsibilities are integral to Te Tiriti. The response to COVID-19, which we're experiencing today, at least we are in Wellington, the response to COVID-19, such as social distancing and self-isolation, shows that most of us understand we have responsibilities to our communities. We've exhibited that in the last 18 months or so. Most of us also grasp that we have a responsibility not to discriminate on any of the prohibited grounds, such as disability, gender, and sexual orientation. Most of us accept we have some sort of responsibility to safeguard our environment. We need to be much clearer that human rights not only grant entitlements, but also place responsibilities on all of us. Nonetheless, I acknowledge we must be very careful about the idea of placing human rights responsibilities on individuals. If a society is plagued by systemic disadvantage, as ours is, and we then place responsibilities on disadvantaged individuals and communities, this runs the risk of reinforcing their disadvantage. I have to say, in the United Nations, I always deliberately avoided saying individuals have human rights responsibilities, because I knew this argument would be misused by authoritarian regimes, by feudal regimes. Here in Aotearoa, for a bunch of reasons that I won't go into, I think it is appropriate to talk about individuals' human rights responsibilities, but I accept the argument needs careful attention to ensure that it does not accidentally do more harm than good. So the 3 R's, relationships, responsibilities, and then the third one is rights. And as we've seen, human rights are about fairness, they're about manaakitanga. Human rights dignify individuals. Human rights empower communities. In the United Nations, successive New Zealand governments have promised to advance civil rights, political rights, workers' rights, social rights, cultural rights, the right to a safe environment, and Indigenous peoples' rights. This broad understanding of human rights reflects what humans value. This broad understanding also chimes with Te Tiriti. Just a few months ago, I wrote an op-ed in which I argued that we had to think in terms of the 3 R's. It was just an editorial editorial page opinion piece in the Dominion Post, in which I talked about, as I've talked this afternoon, about the importance of seeing human rights as a question of responsibilities and relationships and indeed rights. And to my delight, a cartoonist in the Dominion Post picked up my op-ed and did this cartoon. She made one correction. I really like the cartoon, but she did make one correction. And I had talked about the Garden of Human Rights and Te Tiriti, and actually Te Tiriti has slipped off. But there you have it, in the Garden of Human Rights, relationships, building relationships between individuals and between communities, and understanding there often comes acceptance. And then the middle panel, we each have responsibilities to each other, like when we maintain physical distance, if we are sick, or pay our fair share toward maintaining our society and environment. And then there is the rights component. Civil, political, worker, social and cultural rights, the right to a safe environment. Each and every one of us deserves the right to thrive. So I was very grateful to the cartoonist for capturing, in a rather elegant way, what I was trying to write in my short article in the Dominion Post. I have to say that I was talking about the 3 R's, responsibilities, relationships and rights, at another meeting, and afterwards someone who I greatly respect, someone came up to me and said, "Paul, I completely get it why you're talking about relationships, and I completely get it why you're talking about responsibilities, but why are you talking about riots?" So, given my accent, I hadn't been sufficiently clear, and she thought I was advocating the 3 R's of relationships, responsibilities, and riots. You can imagine the headline, Commissioner for Human Rights urges public to riot. So, it's not riots, it's rights. And it seems to me that if we are to understand the 3 R's and implement them, then these human rights have to be brought home. They have to be brought home. They have to be situated and implemented within our unique historical context, demographic context, within our unique environmental and legal context, including Te Tiriti o Waitangi. That, it seems to me, is one of the great challenges confronting us, is how to bring human rights home so that they are relevant and meaningful in our distinctive, unique context. It seems to me that there are signs it's going to be very challenging to do what I've just said, to bring these human rights home. I think it's going to be very challenging. I've often been told by diplomats, some of them representatives of misogynistic, authoritarian, racist, homophobic states, I've often been told by diplomats, don't worry, our laws and policies may not explicitly mention human rights, but don't worry about it. Those human rights implicitly shape all that we do. More surprising, I've heard the same argument from diplomats of liberal democratic states. And I have to tell you that since my appointment to the Human Rights Commission, I've heard versions of this argument on Lambton Key and the Beehive. In fact, one version of that argument just in the last couple of days. Now, this argument, we don't have to worry because officials will ensure the human rights are implicitly honoured. This argument is patronising, it's self-serving, and it masks human rights. It drains power away from individuals and communities to those in authority. It means only those in authority know whether and when human rights are being taken into account, and if they are, how they're being interpreted and how they're being applied. And such arbitrariness is deeply objectionable. Explicitly, not implicitly, explicitly framing something as a human right matters. Without the status of a human right, it is shorn of its transformative promise, its emancipatory promise, and its relational promise. But how can we make explicit human rights more operational, more relevant to the everyday lives of everybody? In 2005, the UN Secretary General Kofi Annan made a speech on human rights, a really important speech, in which he emphasized that, and he said, the era of declaration is now giving way to the era of implementation. The era of declaration, he said, was giving way to the era of implementation. What he meant was that since 1945, the international community has negotiated or declared an impressive and extensive battery of international human rights instruments. And now, he was saying, the time has come to make these treaties real, to take them off the shelves and to make them real, to implement them in everyday lives. So this major shift from declaring to implementing has dramatic implications for the United Nations, which I've written about elsewhere. Very briefly, what I call the UN human rights mainland, such as the UN Human Rights Council, the UN human rights mainland can draft human rights, can declare human rights, but it's not designed to implement them. UN human rights implementation has to take place elsewhere in UN operational agencies, such as the World Health Organization. In other words, in this new era of human rights implementation, the UN needs both its human rights mainland, such as the UN Human Rights Council, and also what I call an archipelago of human rights initiatives which are scattered across UN operational agencies. Now, this shift from declaration to implementation is not only relevant in the United Nations, it's got dramatic implications at country level. The mainland of human rights and archipelago of human rights initiatives, this analogy also applies in Aotearoa. In New Zealand, the human rights mainland includes the Ministry of Justice, Crown Law, possibly the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. But for the most part, the mainland of human rights in Aotearoa is not designed to implement human rights. Human rights implementation has to take place in local and central agencies, such as the Ministries of Health, Education and Social Development. So in this new era of implementation of human rights, New Zealand needs its human rights mainland, such as the Ministry of Justice, but also it needs an archipelago of human rights initiatives across central agencies. Human rights implementation will be impossible in this country without the positive engagement of mainland and the archipelago in Aotearoa. But if this is correct, we have to distinguish compliance with implementation. Put very simply, compliance is usually a tick box exercise late in a policy process to check whether there's conformity with a law or with a rule. That's compliance. Implementation is totally different. It refers to interventions and initiatives that are designed to make something happen on the ground in real life. So if our government wishes to implement the right to health and reduce, say, rheumatic fever, it turns to the Ministry of Health. It turns to district health boards and the Ministry of Housing as well. Lawyers, probably from the Ministry of Justice, are likely to undertake a human rights compliance check. But implementation has to be done by professionals working in central agencies, health professionals, housing experts, educationalists, environmentalists, town planners, economists, and so on, working hand in glove with local communities and respecting the credo, nothing about us without us. So during the era of human rights implementation, a wide range of sectoral professions have to step up. And if we depend on lawyers to implement, say, the right to health, we will all die prematurely. Health professionals have to do this with us and for us. But I have to say that the government has not adjusted to the era of implementation heralded by Kofi Annan in 2005. In Aotearoa, human rights, which remember embody our values, in Aotearoa, human rights should be on the policy table. They should be there early in the policy-making process. That's what's needed in the era of implementation. Human rights-shaped policies and other initiatives. The era of implementation is less about going to court, it's more about integrating human rights into policies. International human rights law is legally binding in Aotearoa. Whether it's brought into our national law or not, international human rights law is legally binding in international law in New Zealand. But integrating human rights into policies depends upon public officials having some familiarity with human rights. And with a few honourable exceptions, central agencies lack the human rights capability required for this new era of human rights implementation. There are exceptions, and they're largely associated with disability rights, women's rights, racism, and to a limited degree, children's rights. As you would expect, the Ministry of Justice and Crown Law have human rights capability in relation to the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act, but this capability does not extend, in my experience, across the spectrum of international human rights that are legally binding on government. Political leadership is needed to elevate the importance of human rights in the public sector in this new era of human rights implementation. And it's really not rocket science. Each central agency needs to have one or two human rights officers who help and support policymakers within their agency. The human rights officers would help their agency colleagues to integrate human rights into policies and other initiatives in those agencies. In their turn, the agency's human rights officers should be supported by the Ministry of Justice, by the Human Rights Commission, if they so wish, and other organisations. If governments are unwilling to enhance human rights capability within the public service, if they are unwilling to bring international human rights to bear upon policy-making initiatives, why bother to draft and ratify human rights treaties in the first place? Now, what's the role of the Human Rights Commission in all this? I'll be brief. It has to be said the Human Rights Commission is misnamed. Its primary focus is non-discrimination and civil and political rights, such as the prohibition against torture and freedom of speech. The Human Rights Commission's primary focus is not the full range of human rights set out in the United Nations: civil, political, workers, social and cultural rights, and the right to a safe environment and Indigenous peoples' rights. It's not just me who's saying this. The report of the Royal Commission of Inquiry into the terrorist attacks in Christchurch on the 15th of March wrote this: despite its name, the Human Rights Act only focuses on one human right, the right to be free from discrimination. One of the leading international authors on national human rights institutions discusses the New Zealand Human Rights Commission and the Canadian Human Rights Commission, and she says this: as anti-discrimination bodies, their focus has largely been on civil and political rights. While the commissions could promote compliance with the full range of international human rights treaties that these countries have ratified, they remain first and foremost anti-discrimination agencies. Three leading New Zealand human rights scholar practitioners, at least one of whom is in the room, describe the predecessor of the Human Rights Act as, quote, primarily an anti-discrimination statute. The earlier legislation to which the authors refer has now been greatly improved, but in my view, the amendments did not alter the sort of DNA of the Human Rights Commission, which continues to lean towards non-discrimination. Don't misunderstand me, I'm not being critical of my predecessors, nor am I being critical of my fellow tireless commissioners, nor am I being critical of commission staff. I'm simply pointing out an institutional bias that is rooted in legislation. The perennial problem facing all national human rights institutions across the globe is how to ensure their independence from government. And so far as I'm aware, no country has solved this problem. The New Zealand government has done well to put in place several safeguards to ensure the Human Rights Commission's independence. For example, an independent panel advises on commissioner appointments. All political parties are then consulted, and then the final decision is made by the Governor-General following advice from the government. As Chief Commissioner, I've never been subjected to any inappropriate pressure, and I have made decisions without fear or favour. On one occasion, I took a position which deeply angered a high-ranking political figure. Later, I discussed this with a minister. He brushed it off. He said, "Paul, you were doing your job." Sometimes difficult questions arise, and I need a wide range of views, including from government. The government's views will not be determinative, but I need to know what they are. In this situation, officials will sometimes decline to give me a view on the grounds I'm independent. And I often find myself saying, I know I'm independent. Nonetheless, I would very much welcome your views, and I reserve the right not to adopt them. Despite the devices put in place to safeguard the Commission's independence, at the end of the day, the Commission, as an independent Crown entity, reports to and is funded by government. There is no perfect alternative, but I tentatively suggest that there is a better alternative. A recent ministerial review favoured consideration of the commissioners becoming officers of Parliament, similar to the Ombudsman. In my opinion, this option should at least be considered. Considered in the light of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, in the light of Article 1, Kawanatanga, in the light of Article 2, Rangatiratanga, and in light of Article 3, which I understand as a pledge of equality and balance. I should bring my remarks to a close. Over the last year or so, the Human Rights Commission has joined forces with the National Iwi Chairs Forum and a non-governmental organisation called Community Housing Aotearoa. And we've prepared what we call framework guidelines on the right to a decent home in Aotearoa. These guidelines aim to bring home to Aotearoa the international human right to a decent home. The guidelines strive to take into account New Zealand's unique social, demographic, historical and legal context, including settler colonisation and including Te Tiriti o Waitangi. The guidelines aim to raise the profile of the right to a decent home among local and national government and among individuals, communities, Hapu and iwi. The guidelines have recently been adopted by my board and they will be launched in the next few weeks. We hope the guidelines will be used by housing policymakers to strengthen their efforts and by rights holders to hold local government, central government and the private sector to account for their human rights responsibilities. That, it seems to me, is one way to refresh human rights in Aotearoa. We have to convey that human rights embody important and dynamic values. We have to convey that they are for everyone, not just some people. We have to bring human rights home. We have to contextualize them. We have to place them at the disposal of communities. We have to make them as operational as possible. We have to insert them in policies. Human rights are not just about me, they're also about us. They are not just about entitlements, they're also about responsibilities. Hold duty bearers accountable for their human rights promises, but not necessarily accountable before the courts. We have to maintain a wide vision of human rights, not just discrimination, although discrimination is crucially important. Fighting discrimination is absolutely imperative. But we need a wider vision than discrimination. We need a wider vision than civil and political rights. We also need the UN vision that we've signed up to, we've ratified it, the wider vision of civil and political rights, non-discrimination, workers' rights, social rights, cultural rights, the right to a safe environment, and Indigenous people's rights. And all of that, underpinned and reinforced by Te Tiriti o Waitangi. Māori ki te rangi, ora ki te whenua, Māori ora ki o tātou katoa. Thank you all very much.